We haven't taken a look down under for quite some time now. And we should, for there has been tremendous progress lately in a few key subjects pertaining to institutionalized misandry, colloquially still mistakenly referred to as feminism. Let's explore. G'day, you cunts! I probably botched the Australian accent badly, but I still had to try. Anyway, hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alrighty, let's talk about Australia. Now, most of the videos about Australia that we've done so far here on Freedom Alternative are about sexual politics in Australia, and in fact with two exceptions, once when I talked about the Australian immigration policy and once when I talked about the libertarian senator who created the triggering complaint form. Everything else is about sexual politics, and that's not by accident, for Australia is the host of a particularly nasty nest of misandrists, especially in the educational establishment, but also in the wider deep state. Australia made headlines on the alternative media with its Safe Schools program, which, as any progressive program, it does the opposite of what it says, namely it makes the schools as unsafe and as mentally dangerous as possible for all boys and especially white boys. But in the last couple of weeks, something's in the air in Australia, as two pieces of very positive news have come out one after the other, so we'll have to take a look at those. So, the first news item comes from the Sydney Morning Herald. The University of Sydney basically introduced a male-only scholarship for veterinary students, and the usual suspects were furious at the idea that such sexism could exist. The scholarship emphasized men. Obviously, none of them were nowhere to be found for the previous thousands of female-only scholarships, but you already know that. However, in the face of backlash, the university stood its ground. That's astonishing, using progressive language. So there's either someone who knows how to agitprop there, or their bureaucrats are simply that naive. Now, quite frankly, both are very possible. So, Sydney University defends new scholarship that favors men as consistent with diversity, reads the headline. Quote, the University of Sydney is standing by a new $27,000 vet science scholarship that favors men after students protested that it constitutes unacceptable sexism. Some vet science students were infuriated when they received notification last week of the Professor Marsh Edwards AO scholarship offered to postgraduate veterinary medicine students for the first time in 2017. The scholarship information says that, quote, preference will be given to applicants who are from rural or regional areas, male, interested in large animal practice, and an Australian citizen, close quote. The women's officer on the Students' Representative Council at the university, Imogen Grant, said female vet students were horrified. A female doctor of a veterinary medicine student who asked not to be named said, quote, I was really surprised. I really thought it was a mistake, some sort of a clerical error. Sexism exists in our society, but I thought the uni held itself to a higher standard. Gender balance in vet science as a profession has reversed in the past 20 years from male to female dominated, but the student said this did not justify the scholarship's terms. Female graduates of vet school are still paid less from day one, she said. Professor Edwards was a lovely man who did a lot of fabulous work. This is not about hurting his reputation. I just think it shows very little thought into the causative agents of underrepresentation of women in STEM. The barriers that prevent men from entering vet science are not the same barriers that prevent women from entering every single other academic area. Well, actually, that's bollocks, but we'll comment in a minute. Miss Grant conceded there were women-only and indigenous-only scholarships offered at the university. Quote, but what distinguishes those scholarships is that they are in place to procure benefits for people who face structural barriers to receiving an education. Quote, "To have male-only scholarships is to continue male privilege within society," she said. A spokeswoman for the university said it was confident that the scholarship complied with discrimination laws. The inclusion of males as one of a number of preferences by the donor is to address the current underrepresentation of males in the student cohort, she said. As such, it is consistent with the university's support of actions to address diversity and the underrepresentation of males or females in certain disciplines or professions, close quote. She said women were still eligible to apply and that academic excellence would be prioritized. Of this year's graduate entry for the Doctor of Veterinary Medicine students, over 90% of the intake is expected to be female. This is a trend seen over the past 5 years, along with an increasing trend away from rural practice. The federal government's latest job outlook data reports that of employed vets, 19% are male full-time and 3% part-time, compared with females 48% full-time and 30% part-time. A 2013 report by the Australian Veterinary Association noted the dramatic gender shift in vet science professionals since the 1980s. Alright. So, as usual, the regressive left gets its knickers in a twist when their own identitarian policies are used for everyone, not just the identity groups that they happen to like this week. But the reality is that when it comes to veterinary practice, there are actually two entirely different sectors within the practice. There's the posh urbanite sector, i.e. posh vets who care for fluffy kittens and other pets for fellow upper middle class urbanites. And then there's the actually useful vets, those who practice in farms and to whom we all owe in part the fact that the agricultural sector is able to produce so much food and so cheaply that the idea of starving to death is simply alien even to the poorest of the poor. So whilst in theory it is the same field, veterinary practice, it is absolutely not the same work. Urbanite vets get to care for largely non-dangerous animals in a heated and safe environment and generally get to do it even part-time and on a relatively fixed schedule. Rural veterinarians get none of these privileges. Now, I don't know how many of you spent time in a deeply rural area, but I did. And my aunt was a rural veterinarian. Now, needless to say, she was the only female vet for rural areas on a radius of 4 counties. Now, why was this happening? Because not many women enjoy stuffing their hands into the pussy of an aggressive cow at 3 a.m. in the morning. And yes, that's part of what a rural vet has to do, sometimes for weeks in a row at all hours. Basically, veterinarians that serve in rural areas have challenges that make their work not only more difficult, but also far riskier. And this is true here in Europe, but it is even truer, if I may say that, in Australia. I mean, at the very least in Europe, not everything that moves outside concrete wants to kill you. In Australia, everything wants to kill you. Urbanites wouldn't know that, I'm sure, but the vets in the rural areas sure do know that. Then after surviving that particular obstacle, you have to be available at all sorts of hours, because if your client's cow is due to deliver offspring right now, it doesn't matter it's 4 a.m. and Christmas night. The need is right now, or else the cow and the offspring dies. So you have to roll up your sleeves and drive there at 4 a.m. and deliver the service. And perhaps unsurprisingly, not very many people want this kind of job, and of those that do want it, the overwhelming majority of them will be men. This will always be true, no matter how much propaganda to encourage women into it you'll shove down the throats of students. Now, when 60% plus of vets were men, this meant that there was a big enough pool of the target demographic that actually was willing to do the hard work in the rural areas, so everyone was just fine. Now, with women flooding the profession, this created an overinflation of vets who do cats and dogs in the posh urban areas, and a shortage of vets that can do horses, cows, sheep, and so on and so forth, and do it in an imperfect and dangerous environment. Now, the market responded to this by increasing the pay of the few ones that still did it. This is basic economics, come on. It has nothing to do with sexism. A man working in the rural areas will probably earn more now than a man working in the urban areas. Or put it this way, a man working in rural areas would lose money if he'd opened practice in the urban areas and moved there. The exact same individual. Now, the university, or actually the donor of that university, believes that the shortage isn't addressed fast enough by the market. Now, whether that's factually true or not, I don't know, and it could be, but it's irrelevant in this case. That's the belief of the one who gives the shekel, and as such, she wants, because the donor is a woman, she wants to specifically recruit men who already live in the rural areas in the hope that this would address some of the veterinary shortages of those areas. Now, is that discriminatory? Yes. Does it matter? Nope. Should it matter? Of course not. And this is the part that regressives will never understand. There is such thing as general trends and reality which inflicts limitations upon any utopian project you may have. Limitation number 1. Most veterinarians in the rural areas will be men. This will never change. Now, you may change the percentage from, 95% male to 90 or to 99%, but the leeway there is small. Limitation number 2. Veterinarians in urban areas will always be more in numbers. Corollary to this is that they will always be paid less. More competition, smaller prices. This applies to labor just like it applies to bananas or computers. Limitation number 3. The easier a job is, the more likely it is for women to flood it. Being a veterinarian in urban areas has become easier and easier as technology has evolved. This creates even more downward pressure on urban veterinarians' income. You can't escape these limitations, and these are the reasons why there's a search for rural men to become vets. Not sexism, not male privilege, not structural barriers, at least not the way you imagine them from your critical theory indoctrination session. None of these things. It's reality that reasserts itself via the means of the market as more and more people realize that this whole pretend game that women can replace men and men can replace women on a whim anywhere and anyway, this game is over. More and more people are not only figuring it out, this has been happening for close to a decade now, but they're also applying their own newfound knowledge and pushback using their wallets. And not a moment too soon. Alright. Let's look into the second news item, coming from The Australian. Gender theory banned in New South Wales classrooms. And goes like this, quote, New South Wales public school teachers have been banned from teaching gender theory in the classroom after an independent review into the state's sex and health education resources. Students will no longer be taught that gender is a social construct or that sexuality is non-binary, occurring on a continuum and constantly changing. An edict encouraging teachers to de-gender their language will also likely be scrapped, along with sexually explicit case studies and teaching aids such as the gender-bred person, which promotes the idea that there are infinite possibilities of gender identity. Announced in September, the review by Professor Bill Loudon followed the reports in The Australian that a sex education resource, the Teacher Toolbox for delivering content related to diversity of sex, sexuality and gender, was promoting safe schools materials, possibly in contravention of federal guidelines. Further revelations about Crossroads, the state's compulsory sex education programs for years 11 and 12, also pushing gender theory, prompted the then Education Minister Adrian Piccoli to order a review into the research base and scientific underpinning of the material. An update of the review has been provided to teachers, detailing a list of resources that should not be used. The list includes the 17-page teacher toolbox resource, the Affirming Diversity unit aimed at Year 10, and 3 of the sexual and gender diversity activities contained within the Crossroads program. The Affirmative Diversity unit. Anyway, one of those, called Opposite Ends of the Pole, encourages students to consider various case studies, including Joseph, a man married with 3 children who masturbates and fantasizes only about men, as well as Alex, who had sex with girls as a teenager but has developed a relationship with a man since moving to a country town. The department yesterday declined to comment on the specific recommendations of the review, and it is not clear whether the ban stems from specific recommendations or is pending the department's response to the review. It is also not clear whether new Education Minister Rob Stokes will have a role in endorsing recommendations from the review. Gender theory and its creeping influence on government-run education has been a controversial topic over the past year, having also underpinned the divisive Safe Schools program. The concept of deconstructing gender derives from the 1990s queer theory and is understood to be highly contested even within the social sciences. According to the New South Wales Education Standards Authority Statement of Equity Principles, curriculum and support materials should reflect evidence-based research. The document also states, however, that teaching materials should provide opportunities for students to evaluate and deconstruct gender and sexuality. Labour MP Greg Donnelly, who has campaigned for the removal of safe schools, called on the Education Department to release the latest review. It is important that the public gets to see what is in the review report, he said. Given the highly controversial statements that were contained in the teaching material, moms and dads are entitled to know what the review report says and recommends. Now, what's lovely in this is not just the result, which reaffirms sanity at the expense of insanity, but that the campaign against the insanity is supported by a Labour MP. Now, this is in itself good news. Now, of course, the misandrist, racist, heterophobe coalition, sometimes known as the LGBTist lobby, attacked the MP viciously in the previous months for his audacity to step off the leftist reservation. Back in November, for instance, the militant Australian LGBTist publication Same blasted the Labour MP with the usual tribes. They said about him that he is, quote, out of touch and out of step. He is a lonely voice on the wrong side of history, close quote. Now, the reality is that the only ones out of touch, out of step, and on the wrong side of not only history but also mental sanity and basic science are the militant LGBTist left. The Australian Labour Party is a bit interesting. It had completely insane figures like Julia Gillard, by far one of the most obnoxious, dumb, incompetent and militant cretins that ever held office in a country that's not North Korea or Venezuela, but it also has figures like Greg Donnelly or Mark Latham, the latter being an advocate for sanity in terms of sexual politics in general. That means he absolutely rejects militant misandrism, and of course, that means the press hates him too. A few months ago, for instance, the militant leftist publication The Guardian attacked Latham for being too white, among other things. I'm not joking, the link is in the low bar. Now, why so much hate? Well, Latham is an anti-feminist. He kinda tends to like Donald Trump, and he appears in a talk show called The Outsiders, meant to counterbalance the overt, extreme leftist generalized bias of ABC, which is the state broadcaster in Australia. In other words, he's triple plus ungood. Now, At the hearing of these two news items, the wider normal majority was happy to hear sanity prevailing at least once. It's been a while since we recorded a win in education. Since 2015, when France cancelled its own genderist national program following weeks of strikes by conservative parents, there hasn't been a successful pushback against this nonsense. I mean, yeah, sure, there were the successful preventions in Poland and Hungary, but to actually roll back already implemented mess, there was a need for such a win. However, the leftist minority did not react so hysterically as, quite frankly, I would have expected. Susie O'Brien, for instance, wrote in the Herald Sun, why these classes are good and basically rehashed the governmental leftist propaganda about it. No substance and no new spin or arguments, but ended timidly with, quote, "Let's hope Victoria doesn't go down the same path as New South Wales. We need respectful relationships now more than ever," close quote. This shows desperation and uncertainty. Now, if you remember, back in November, I made a video about the refusal of a Victoria teacher who made headlines with her opposition to this nonsense, and the opposition is steadily growing. The believers in this nonsense are unsure of themselves right now. To say they're a bit off balance is to put it mildly. They're frightened, which is why, now more than ever, to quote Susie O'Brien, they should be hit harder. They are vulnerable, possibly for the first time, in their grip on the educational establishment. Any Australian watching this should go back and watch my practical politics videos and start applying some of that. If 50 red-pilled people in Victoria join the PTA types of organizations and start agitating against this nonsense, the safe schools and safe relationships nonsense could be over by the end of the current year. This is indeed doable, I'm not joking here, and all the signs available show that the opposition is at an all-time low. This is a moment that indeed needs to be seized. Also, do take advantage of the fact that the new generation is far more conservative. Your average 14-year-old today is more conservative than you were at 14 years old, or your parents were when they were 14. Do encourage youngsters to object, politely and respectfully, but firmly. The opposition has lost its carrot, or more precisely, the public realized that there is no carrot, and its stick is softer than ever, which is why it is the best climate now to go on the offensive. Alright. I think that's enough for now. Basically, the takeaway is this: the climate is ripe for a wider and lasting pushback against the leftist-driven social engineering of children, and it would be deeply unfortunate for Australians to miss out of this opportunity. Milk the most of this window. I'm dead serious here. You already have in Australia students willing to troll the leftist establishment into oblivion. Time to bring that in schools as well. Pissing off leftists is cool. Conservatism is the new punk. Just use that. It's once in a generation momentum and ought not to be missed. And with all of that being said, thank you for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.